The morning started with the usual courthouse chaos. People rushed through metal detectors, lawyers juggled briefcases and coffee cups, and the sound of dress shoes clicking against marble floors echoed through the hallways. It was just another Tuesday at the downtown courthouse, or so everyone thought. Courtroom 5B was packed that morning. Every wooden bench in the public gallery was filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Some looked nervous, fidgeting with their phones or whispering to their attorneys. Others sat quietly, staring at the floor or the ceiling, lost in their own thoughts. The air conditioning hummed loudly, fighting against the warm bodies filling the room. Judge Thomas Richardson had been on the bench for almost 20 years. He was known for running a tight ship, but he was fair. His gray hair and reading glasses gave him that classic judge look, and when he spoke, people listened. This morning he was working through a long list of cases, each one requiring his full attention. Among the crowd sat a woman in her late 40s. She wore a crisp navy blue blazer over a simple white blouse and dark pants. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make her stand out. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a small leather notebook. She sat in the third row, right on the aisle, observing everything with quiet intensity. Most people probably thought she was an attorney waiting for her case to be called. Maybe a social worker or a court administrator. She had that professional air about her, the kind of presence that comes from years of working in serious environments. But she wasn't fidgeting like the nervous defendants, and she wasn't shuffling through papers like the busy lawyers. She just watched, taking occasional notes, her eyes moving from the judge to the attorneys to the defendant and back again. Up front, a young man was being questioned about a traffic violation that had escalated into something more serious. His public defender was doing her best to explain the circumstances, but the defendant kept interrupting, his voice getting louder with each sentence. You could feel the tension building in the room. Officer Danny Rodriguez had been working courthouse security for about 3 years. He was in his early 30s, built like someone who took his gym time seriously, and he took his job even more seriously. His role was simple: keep order in the courtroom, protect the judge, and make sure nothing disrupted the proceedings. He stood near the side wall, arms crossed, watching everyone like a hawk. When the young defendant started raising his voice, Rodriguez moved immediately. It was instinct, really. Years of training had taught him to spot potential problems before they exploded. The defendant was standing now, gesturing wildly with his hands as he argued with his own lawyer. The judge raised his gavel, but before he could bring it down, the defendant took a step forward. That's when everything went sideways. Rodriguez moved quickly through the narrow space between the benches. His eyes were locked on the agitated defendant, his training telling him to neutralize any threat to court order. But in his rush, he didn't notice that the woman in the navy blazer had shifted slightly in her seat. Leaning forward to get a better view of what was happening, his hand shot out and grabbed her arm just above the elbow. His grip was firm, the kind of grip that meant business. "Ma'am, you need to stay seated," he said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that security officers use when they expect immediate compliance. The woman's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, she seemed too shocked to respond. Then, as his grip tightened, she tried to pull her arm back. "Officer," she said, her voice steady but strained, "I think you've made a mistake." But Rodriguez wasn't listening. In his mind, he was dealing with someone trying to interfere with a volatile situation. He'd seen it before. Family members jumping up to defend their loved ones, angry spectators trying to leave in the middle of testimony, all sorts of disruptions. His job was to prevent those disruptions, and that's exactly what he was doing. "I need you to come with me right now," he insisted, his other hand moving to her shoulder as he tried to guide her toward the aisle. The woman didn't fight him, but she didn't move either. She planted her feet and spoke again, louder this time. "Officer Rodriguez, I really think you should check who I am before you continue." There was something in her voice, something that made a few people in the front rows turn around. A couple of the attorneys who had been focused on their own cases looked up, their eyes moving from the officer to the woman. One lawyer, a woman in her 60s who'd been practicing in these courts for decades, suddenly went pale. She stood up halfway from her seat, her mouth opening as if to say something. But Rodriguez was focused on what he saw as his duty. The defendant up front had been corralled by another officer now, but Rodriguez was committed to removing what he thought was a disturbance. "Ma'am, you can explain everything outside the courtroom. Right now I need you to come with me." The woman took a deep breath. You could see her making a choice in that moment, deciding whether to pull rank immediately or to see how this would play out. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It wasn't angry, but it carried a weight that cut through the courtroom noise. Officer Rodriguez, I am here by appointment. I suggest you verify the day's schedule before you make a decision you'll regret. That's when Judge Richardson's attention finally pulled away from the defendant. He'd been so focused on restoring order to the front of his courtroom that he hadn't noticed the scuffle developing in the gallery. But now, as his eyes landed on the scene, on Officer Rodriguez with his hand still firmly gripping the woman's arm, his expression changed completely. The gavel came down hard, once, twice, 3 times. The sharp crack of wood on wood silenced the entire room. Officer Rodriguez, the judge's voice boomed through the courtroom and every head turned. Release that woman this instant. Rodriguez froze. His hand was still on her arm, but everything else about him stopped moving. His eyes went to the judge, then back to the woman, then to the judge again. Confusion spread across his face like someone had just spoken to him in a foreign language. The elderly attorney who had started to stand was now fully on her feet. Your Honor, she said, her voice shaking slightly, I believe Officer Rodriguez may not have been properly briefed about today's observer. Observer? Rodriguez's mind raced. What observer? He looked down at the woman whose arm he was still holding, and for the first time he really looked at her. Not as a potential disruption, but as a person. Her calm expression, her professional attire, the way she was looking at him now, not with anger, but with something that might have been disappointment. Another officer near the front of the courtroom had straightened to attention, his eyes wide as he stared at the woman. Then another. Within seconds, every security officer in the room had the same expression, a mixture of recognition and dawning horror. Rodriguez's hand fell away from her arm as if he'd been burned. He took a step back, then another, his face draining of color as the pieces started falling into place. The professional clothes, the notebook, the way she'd been observing everything, the judge's reaction, the attorney's expressions, oh no, no. The woman straightened her blazer and rubbed her arm where red marks were already forming from his grip. She didn't look at Rodriguez. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, waiting to see what would happen next. The entire courtroom held its breath, sensing that something significant was unfolding, even if most of them didn't understand exactly what. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. You know that feeling when something goes terribly wrong and time seems to slow down? That's exactly what was happening. Officer Rodriguez stood there, his arms now hanging uselessly at his sides, staring at the woman he just grabbed. His brain was working overtime trying to process what was happening, but he couldn't quite get there yet. Judge Richardson set his gavel down slowly and removed his reading glasses. He pinched the bridge of his nose, the way people do when they're trying to manage a headache that just got 10 times worse. When he looked up again, his face was a mixture of frustration and something else. Disappointment, maybe. Officer Rodriguez, the judge said, and his voice was quieter now, which somehow made it worse than when he'd been shouting. Do you know who you just put your hands on? Rodriguez opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. His eyes darted around the courtroom looking for some kind of help, some explanation that would make this make sense. The other security officers wouldn't meet his gaze. They were all staring at the floor or the walls or anywhere except at him. The woman in the navy blazer finally spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled, but you could hear the edge underneath. I think we should address this situation properly, Your Honor, for everyone's benefit. Judge Richardson nodded. Yes, I think we should. He looked at the packed courtroom, at all the people who were now sitting up straight, fully invested in this unexpected drama. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief recess. All cases scheduled for this morning will resume in 30 minutes. Nobody moved. Not a single person stood up to leave. The judge noticed this and sighed. That means you need to clear the courtroom. Now, please. The bailiff, an older man who'd seen just about everything in his 30 years on the job, started, airing people out. Lawyers gathered their papers reluctantly, clearly not wanting to miss what was about to happen. The defendants and their families filed out slowly, craning their necks to get one last look at the scene. Within a few minutes, the courtroom was empty except for the judge, the woman, Officer Rodriguez, 2 other security officers, and the court reporter who was still sitting at her little desk, fingers hovering over her keys. Judge Richardson gestured for the woman to approach the bench. She walked forward with steady, measured steps. As she passed Rodriguez, he instinctively took a step back, like he was afraid to get too close to her now. She didn't even glance at him. "Margaret," Judge Richardson said quietly, and the use of her first name told Rodriguez everything he needed to know. His stomach dropped. "I apologize. I was told you were coming, but I didn't think to brief all the security personnel." "Margaret, Judge Margaret." Rodriguez felt his knees go weak. The woman turned to face the courtroom, and now Rodriguez could see her more clearly. She had that look, that presence that came from years of authority. How had he missed it? She rubbed her arm again where his fingers had dug in, and he could see the red marks turning darker. "Officer Rodriguez," she said, and hearing her say his name made him want to disappear into the floor. "Do you know who I am now?" He managed to nod. "You're a judge," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just a judge," one of the other officers muttered under his breath. Rodriguez shot him a look that said, "Not helping, but the damage was already done. Judge Margaret Hendricks." "Circuit Court Judge, Appellate Division." Rodriguez felt like he might throw up. He'd just manhandled one of the most respected judges in the entire state court system. She sat on the Judicial Review Board. She evaluated other judges. She made decisions that affected thousands of cases, and he'd grabbed her like she was some random person causing trouble. "I'm Judge Hendricks," she said, confirming what he'd already figured out. "I'm here as part of a routine observation. The Judicial Review Board sends judges to observe courtroom proceedings unannounced. It's how we assess whether proper procedures are being followed." She paused, letting that sink in. "Procedures like how security officers interact with the public." Rodriguez wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that he was just doing his job, that there was a disturbance, that he thought she was moving toward the commotion. But every excuse that formed in his mind sounded hollow, because the truth was right there, impossible to ignore. He'd grabbed a woman without asking questions, without trying to communicate first, without even checking if she was actually doing anything wrong. "I was trying to maintain order," he finally managed to say, but even to his own ears it sounded weak. Judge Hendricks tilted her head slightly. "Were you? Let me ask you something, Officer Rodriguez. Before you put your hands on me, did you see me stand up?" He thought back. "No, but did you see me move toward the defendant?" "No. Did you see me do anything other than lean forward in my seat?" He swallowed hard. "No, ma'am. So you grabbed me because I shifted my position in my seat during a tense moment." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, and it hit like a punch to the gut. Judge Richardson cleared his throat. "Margaret, again, I take full responsibility. I should have made sure everyone knew you were here." She held up her hand. "With respect, Thomas, this isn't about whether Officer Rodriguez knew I was a judge. This is about how he treated someone he believed was a regular citizen." She turned back to Rodriguez, and her eyes were sharp now. "Tell me, officer, if I had been just a regular person watching court proceedings, which is their right, would grabbing me the way you did have been appropriate?" The question hung in the air. Rodriguez knew the answer. He'd known it the moment Judge Richardson had called out to him, maybe even before that. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I didn't hear you." "No, ma'am," he said louder. "It wouldn't have been appropriate." "Why not?" He struggled to find the words. "Because you weren't doing anything wrong. You were just sitting there. I should have assessed the situation better. I should have communicated verbally first. I should have—" He trailed off. "You should have treated me like a human being deserving of respect and dignity," Judge Hendricks finished for him. "The fact that I'm a judge makes this embarrassing for you, Officer Rodriguez. But the real problem is that you would have done the same thing to anyone else sitting in that seat." The words cut deep, because they were true. Rodriguez had been so focused on the agitated defendant that he'd stopped thinking about everyone else as individuals. He'd seen potential problems instead of people. One of the other security officers shifted uncomfortably. Judge Richardson was watching the whole exchange with a grim expression. The court reporter's fingers were flying across her keys, recording every word. "I'm sorry," Rodriguez said, and he meant it. "I'm truly sorry, Your Honor. There's no excuse for what I did." Judge Hendricks studied him for a long moment. "Apologies are important, Officer Rodriguez, but they're not enough. What matters is what you learn from this and what changes because of it." She looked at Judge Richardson. "Thomas, I think we need to turn this into something constructive. This isn't just about one officer making a mistake. This is about systemic issues in how we think about authority, security, and respect. Judge Richardson nodded slowly. What do you have in mind? Judge Hendricks looked around the empty courtroom, then back at Rodriguez. I think we need to have a conversation about all of this. A real honest conversation. And I think we need to have it when court resumes. She paused. With the full courtroom present, Rodriguez felt his face flush. A public conversation about his mistake? In front of everyone? But before he could think too much about it, Judge Richardson was agreeing. That's a good idea, the judge said. A teaching moment. Judge Hendricks rubbed her arm one more time and Rodriguez noticed her wince slightly. The guilt hit him fresh. He'd hurt her. Not seriously, but enough to leave marks. Enough that she'd probably be sore tomorrow. And the worst part was, it could have been so much worse. If she'd resisted more, if he'd pulled harder, if things had escalated. The what-ifs were terrifying. Officer Rodriguez, Judge Hendricks said, pulling him from his thoughts. In 30 minutes, when people come back into this courtroom, we're going to talk about what happened here. I'm going to ask you some hard questions. I'm going to talk about things you probably won't want to hear, but I need you to understand something. She paused, making sure he was really listening. This isn't about destroying you. This is about making sure this never happens to anyone else. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His career was probably over anyway. Who keeps a security officer who manhandles a circuit court judge? As if reading his mind, Judge Hendricks added, and for the record, I'm not interested in seeing you fired. I'm interested in seeing you educated. There's a difference. Those words gave him the smallest spark of hope, but they also made the weight on his shoulders feel heavier. Because now he had to face a courtroom full of people and own up to everything he'd done wrong. And somehow that felt harder than just losing his job. The 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. Rodriguez stood in the corner of the courtroom, his mind racing through every decision he'd made that morning. The other security officers kept their distance, not out of anger, but because they didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who just made a career-ending mistake in front of dozens of witnesses? Outside in the hallway, word had spread like wildfire. A courthouse security officer had grabbed a circuit court judge. The story was being whispered from lawyer to lawyer, from defendant to family member, from clerk to bailiff. By the time the 30 minutes were up, there were twice as many people trying to get back into courtroom 5B than there had been before. Judge Richardson's bailiff had to limit entry. Fire code, he kept saying, but everyone knew the real reason. This wasn't just another court session anymore. This was something people would talk about for years. When the doors finally opened, people filed in quickly, filling every available seat. Some lawyers who didn't even have cases that morning found reasons to be there. A few off-duty court staff members slipped in through the side entrance. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of all those bodies, and the air conditioning struggled even more than before. Rodriguez took his position along the wall, but it felt different now. Before, he'd stood there with authority, with purpose. Now he felt exposed, like everyone was looking at him. Because they were. Dozens of pairs of eyes kept glancing his way, then quickly looking away when he noticed. Judge Hendricks sat in the third row again, same seat as before. She'd taken a few minutes during the break to make a phone call and jot down some notes. The red marks on her arm had darkened to purple. She wasn't trying to hide them. Judge Richardson entered from his chambers and everyone stood. The usual routine. He took his seat, arranged his papers, and looked out at the packed courtroom. You could feel the anticipation humming through the room like electricity. Please be seated, he said, and the sound of everyone sitting down at once echoed off the walls. Before we resume our regular calendar, we need to address something that happened here this morning. He paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. He did. An incident occurred. That I believe requires immediate discussion, not just for those involved, but for everyone who works in or visits this courthouse. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning vents whistling. Judge Margaret Hendricks is here, today as an official observer from the Judicial Review Board. During a tense moment earlier, one of our security officers made a serious error in judgment. Judge Richardson's eyes moved to Rodriguez. Officer Rodriguez, please step forward. Rodriguez's legs felt like lead, but he moved. Each step toward the front of the courtroom felt like walking toward his own execution. When he reached the space between the judge's bench and the gallery, he stopped and stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back. Judge Hendricks. Richardson continued. has agreed to address this court about what happened and why it matters. Judge Hendricks, the floor is yours. Judge Hendricks stood up and the room seemed to hold its breath. She walked down the aisle with the same measured steps as before, her heels clicking against the floor. When she reached the front, she didn't go to the witness stand. She didn't stand behind the prosecutor's table. She stood right in the center of the room where everyone could see her clearly. "My name is Judge Margaret Hendricks," she began, her voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom. "I've been a judge for 17 years. Before that, I was a prosecutor for 8 years, and before that, a public defender for 5. I say this not to brag, but to establish that I've spent 3 decades in courtrooms just like this one." She held up her arm, turning it so everyone could see the bruises. A few people in the gallery gasped quietly. This morning, while I was sitting quietly in the 3rd row, Officer Rodriguez grabbed my arm and attempted to remove me from the courtroom. He didn't ask me what I was doing. He didn't give me a verbal warning. He simply decided I needed to be removed, and he used physical force to try to make that happen. Rodriguez felt his face burning. Hearing it laid out like that in front of all these people made it sound even worse than he'd thought. "Now," Judge Hendricks continued, "some of you might be thinking, well, he didn't know she was a judge. If he'd known, he wouldn't have done it. And that's exactly the problem." She let that sink in for a moment. "The issue isn't that Officer Rodriguez grabbed a judge. The issue is that he grabbed a person who was doing absolutely nothing wrong." An older woman in the gallery nodded in agreement. A young public defender was taking notes furiously. I was sitting in my seat. I leaned forward to get a better view of a tense situation developing at the front of the courtroom. That's it. That's all I did. And for that I was grabbed, manhandled, and nearly dragged out of this room. She turned to look at Rodriguez. "Officer Rodriguez, can you tell everyone here what you were thinking when you grabbed me?" This was it. The moment he'd been dreading. Rodriguez swallowed hard and forced himself to speak. I saw the defendant getting agitated. I was moving to help contain the situation. "I thought you were getting involved or trying to leave during an active proceeding. Did you see me stand up?" "No, ma'am." "Did you see me speak or gesture toward the defendant?" "No, ma'am." "So you made an assumption based on my body language alone?" Rodriguez wanted to defend himself, to explain the split-second decision-making that security work requires. But standing there facing her in front of all these people, he realized how weak any defense would sound. "Yes, ma'am. I made an assumption. And I was wrong." Judge Hendricks nodded slowly. "You were wrong. But here's what keeps me up at night, Officer Rodriguez. How many other people have you grabbed like that? How many regular citizens, people without law degrees or positions of authority, have been treated the same way I was treated today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez thought about his 3 years in courthouse security. How many times had he been rough with someone he deemed uncooperative? How many times had he used force first and asked questions later? The memories made him uncomfortable. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "You don't know," Judge Hendricks repeated, "and that's the heart of the problem. We've created a system where people in positions of authority, police officers, security guards, even judges, can use force without really thinking about it, without considering whether it's necessary or appropriate." She turned to address the whole courtroom now. "Every single person who walks through those doors has rights. The right to be treated with dignity, the right to be spoken to before being grabbed, the right to have their actions accurately assessed before force is used against them. Those rights don't disappear just because you're in a courthouse. In fact, they should be more protected here than anywhere else." A lawyer in the front row was nodding vigorously. Several people in the gallery were leaning forward, completely absorbed. "But there's something else I want to address," Judge Hendricks continued. "When Officer Rodriguez grabbed me, my first instinct was to tell him who I was, to pull rank, as it were, and I'm ashamed to admit that part of me wanted to do that. Part of me wanted to see the look on his face when he realized he'd grabbed a circuit court judge." She paused. "But then I thought, what about all the people who can't pull rank? What about the single mother who comes here for a custody hearing? What about the elderly man here for a traffic ticket? What about the teenager on a minor charge? They don't have the power I have. They don't have a title that makes people back down." The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Richardson was leaning back in his chair, watching with an unreadable expression. "So I decided to let this play out," Judge Hendricks said. "I wanted to see how far it would go. I wanted to really understand what it feels like to be powerless in a moment like that." And I'll tell you something, it was terrifying. Her voice caught slightly. Even knowing who I am, even knowing I could stop it at any moment, feeling someone's hands on me, being told I had no choice, being physically moved against my will, it was one of the most frightening experiences of my professional life. Rodriguez felt tears pricking at his eyes. He'd done that to her. He'd made a respected judge feel terrified. How many other people had he made feel that way? "Officer Rodriguez," she said, turning back to him, "I want you to understand something. I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to ruin your career or make an example out of you in some vindictive way. But I'm going to use this moment, this terrible moment, to try to change something." She looked at Judge Richardson. "With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to do something unusual." Judge Richardson raised his eyebrows. "What did you have in mind?" Judge Hendricks took a deep breath. "I'd like to sit at the bench. I'd like to address this court from the position of authority that Officer Rodriguez and everyone else here needs to understand and respect." The request sent a ripple of whispers through the gallery. It was unprecedented. Judge Richardson was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then slowly he nodded and stood up. "The bench is yours, Judge Hendricks." Judge Richardson stepped down from the bench with a quiet dignity. It wasn't something anyone in that courtroom had ever seen before. A sitting judge in his own courtroom, giving up his seat to another judge. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was bigger than protocol now. This was about something that mattered more than procedure. Judge Hendricks climbed the 3 steps to the bench, her hand briefly touching the wooden rail for support. When she sat down in the high-backed leather chair, the perspective of the entire room shifted. From up there she could see every face, every expression, every person leaning forward or sitting back, every security officer standing at attention along the walls. She adjusted the microphone and looked down at Officer Rodriguez, who seemed smaller now, more vulnerable. Then she looked out at the packed gallery, the lawyers in their suits, the defendants in their street clothes, the family members clutching tissues, the court staff trying to maintain their professional composure. "From up here," she began, her voice amplified but not loud. "Everyone looks different. You have power up here. Authority. When you sit in this chair, people listen to you. They have to. That's what the robe means. That's what this position represents." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room. But with that power comes a responsibility that's almost crushing in its weight. A young woman in the back shifted her baby to her other hip. The child had been quiet, but now let out a small coo that echoed in the silence. Judge Hendricks smiled softly at the sound. "I want to talk about power," she continued. "Not just the power of a judge, but the power that we give to anyone in a uniform. Police officers, security guards, bailiffs, even parking enforcement officers. We give them authority over others, and we trust them to use that authority wisely." She looked directly at Rodriguez. "But what happens when that trust is broken?" Rodriguez stood perfectly still, but you could see his jaw working, the muscles in his neck tense. What happened this morning wasn't just one officer making a mistake. It was a symptom of something much larger. It's what happens when we train people to see threats instead of humans, when we teach them that control matters more than communication, when we tell them, implicitly or explicitly, that their judgment is more important than someone else's dignity. An older attorney in the front row took off his glasses and wiped them, though they didn't look dirty. It was just something to do with his hands while he processed what he was hearing. "I've sat on this side of the bench for 17 years, Judge Hendricks said. "I've seen thousands of cases. I've watched countless security officers do their jobs. And most of them, the vast majority, are good people trying to do difficult work. They keep us safe. They handle dangerous situations with professionalism. They make split-second decisions that most of us never have to make." She leaned forward slightly. "But that doesn't excuse what happened today." She picked up a pen from the desk, turned it over in her hands. It was a simple gesture, but it made her seem more human, less like an untouchable figure of authority. "Officer Rodriguez, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. When you grabbed my arm this morning, how much force did you think you were using?" Rodriguez thought about the question. "I thought I was being firm but not aggressive. I was trying to guide you, not hurt you." "But you did hurt me," she said simply, showing her bruised arm again. "Not seriously, thank God, but you left marks. You caused pain. And that gap between what you intended and what actually happened, That's what we need to talk about." She set the pen down and folded her hands. The problem with power is that the person holding it often doesn't feel how heavy it is. When you're the one doing the grabbing, you don't feel what it's like to be grabbed. When you're the one giving orders, you don't feel what it's like to have your choices taken away. That gap in perspective, that inability to feel what the other person feels, is what leads to abuse. A man in the gallery who looked like he might have had his own encounters with heavy-handed authority was nodding along with every word. "So here's what I want everyone in this room to understand," Judge Hendricks said, her voice growing stronger. "Every person who comes through those doors is someone's daughter or son, someone's mother or father, someone's friend. They have lives and dreams and fears just like everyone else. And just because they're in a courthouse, just because they might be accused of something or involved in a legal matter, doesn't mean they stop being human beings who deserve respect." She looked at the young mother with the baby. "That woman in the back is bouncing a baby. She's probably here for something family-related, maybe a custody issue, maybe child support. Whatever it is, she's scared. She's worried about her child's future. She doesn't need someone in uniform making her feel more afraid than she already is." The young mother's eyes filled with tears. Judge Hendricks wasn't calling her out. She was seeing her, really seeing her. "And that elderly gentleman in the third row," she continued, gesturing to a man who looked to be in his 70s. "He probably took the bus to get here. Maybe he's here for a traffic ticket or a property dispute. He's someone's grandfather. He's lived a whole life. He deserves to be spoken to with patience and respect, even if he doesn't understand all the legal proceedings." The elderly man sat up a little straighter, surprised to be acknowledged. "This is what we forget," Judge Hendricks said, her voice softer now. "We forget that justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat each other in the process of seeking that justice. A courthouse should be the one place where people feel protected, where they feel heard, where they feel like they matter. Instead, too often it's a place where they feel small and powerless and scared." Judge Richardson, standing to the side, nodded in agreement. He'd been doing this job for 2 decades, and he was realizing he'd become blind to some of these truths. "Officer Rodriguez," Judge Hendricks said, bringing her attention back to him, "I want you to know something. What you did this morning was wrong. It was a violation of my rights, and it was a violation of the trust that we place in security officers. But I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who's been trained in a system that values control over compassion, compliance over communication." Rodriguez's shoulders sagged slightly, not with relief but with the weight of understanding. "The question now is, what do we do about it?" She let that question sit for a moment. "I could file a formal complaint. I could demand your termination. I could make this into a legal matter that follows you for the rest of your career." She paused. "But I don't think that serves anyone." You could feel the shift in the room. People had been expecting punishment, accountability in the traditional sense. This was something different. "What I want," Judge Hendricks continued, "is for you to take this experience and turn it into something meaningful. I want you to become the person who trains other officers on what not to do. I want you to be the voice that says, 'Wait, let's try talking first.' I want you to remember how you feel right now, standing in front of all these people owning your mistake, and use that feeling to make sure you never make someone else feel powerless again." Rodriguez's eyes were red now, but he was listening to every word. "Can you do that?" she asked. "Can you take this terrible moment and transform it into something that actually helps people?" He nodded, his voice thick when he spoke. "Yes, Your Honor, I can." "I will." "Good," she said, "because that's what accountability really looks like. Not just punishment, not just consequences, but change. Real, meaningful change that makes the system better for everyone." She stood up from the bench, and the action felt ceremonial somehow. She'd said what needed to be said. She'd used the power of that position not to condemn, but to teach, not to destroy, but to build something better. Judge Richardson stepped forward to reclaim his seat, but before Judge Hendricks could descend the steps, a woman in the gallery stood up. She was in her 40s, wearing a worn jacket, and she looked nervous, but she spoke anyway. "Thank you," she said simply. "My son had a case here last year. The way security treated him, like he was already guilty, like he didn't matter, it broke something in him. So thank you for saying this." Another person stood, then another. Within moments, half the courtroom was on their feet. Not clapping or cheering, just standing. A silent acknowledgement that something important had just happened. Judge Hendricks descended from the bench, her eyes glistening. She hadn't expected this. She'd just wanted to turn a bad situation into a teaching moment, but it had become something more. It had become a moment where people felt seen and heard in a system that often made them feel invisible. As she walked back toward her seat in the gallery, she paused next to Officer Rodriguez. For a second, it looked like she might walk past him without a word, but then she stopped and extended her hand. He looked at it, then at her face, searching for any sign of anger or resentment. He found none. Just a quiet determination to make things better. He shook her hand, and in that handshake was an understanding. A promise. A chance at redemption that he knew he didn't deserve, but was grateful to receive anyway. 3 months later, Officer Rodriguez stood in front of a classroom full of courthouse security officers. The room was in the basement of the main courthouse building, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of coffee from the break room drifting through the open door. 23 officers sat in rows of plastic chairs, some looking interested, others checking their phones, a few with their arms crossed like they'd rather be anywhere else. This was the 4th training session Rodriguez had led, and it still made his stomach twist into knots, not because he was afraid of public speaking, but because every time he told the story, he had to relive the worst moment of his professional life. "Good morning," he began, and the room settled into an attentive silence. "My name is Officer Danny Rodriguez, and I'm here to talk to you about the day I almost lost my job, my dignity, and my understanding of what it means to serve the public." That got their attention. The officers who'd been on their phones looked up. The skeptical ones leaned forward slightly. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that changed everything for me. I grabbed someone I shouldn't have grabbed. I used force when I should have used words. And I did it in front of a packed courtroom, in front of judges and lawyers and regular people who trusted me to protect them, not intimidate them. He pulled up a slide on the projection screen. It showed the basic outline of courthouse security protocols, the official guidelines they were all supposed to follow. We all know these rules. Verbal warning first. Assess the situation. Use minimum necessary force. We memorize them for our training. We recite them for our evaluations. But how many of us actually follow them in the moment? A younger officer in the front row raised her hand tentatively. It's different when things are happening fast, though, right? When there's a real threat, you don't have time to think about every protocol. Rodriguez nodded. You're absolutely Great. When there's a genuine threat, you act. That's your job. That's what you're trained for. But here's the question I had to ask myself. How often do we tell ourselves something is a threat when it really isn't? He clicked to the next slide. It was blank except for one sentence. A woman leaned forward in her seat. "That's what happened," Rodriguez said. "That's the threat," I responded to. A woman in professional clothes sitting quietly in the gallery leaned forward to get a better view of what was happening. And I grabbed her. Hard enough to leave bruises. Hard enough to scare her. Hard enough that she could have filed charges against me if she'd wanted to. The room was completely silent now. The woman was Judge Margaret Hendricks, Circuit Court Judge, member of the Judicial Review Board, one of the most respected legal minds in this state. He paused. But that's not why what I did was wrong. It was wrong because she was a human being who wasn't doing anything that required physical intervention. It would have been just as wrong if she'd been a lawyer, a defendant's mother, or someone who'd wandered in off the street to watch court proceedings. He told them the whole story, the agitated defendant, the split-second decision, the moment Judge Richardson called out his name, the bruises on her arm, the way she could have destroyed his career but chose not to, the speech she gave from the bench, the handshake afterward that felt like both forgiveness and a challenge. Judge Hendricks gave me a choice, Rodriguez said. She could have ended my career that day. Instead, she asked me if I could turn my mistake into something that helps other people. She asked me if I could change. He looked around the room. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm standing in front of you, telling you the most embarrassing story of my life. Because if my mistake can keep even one of you from making the same error, then maybe something good came from it. An older officer in the back, someone who'd been doing this job for 15 years, spoke up. So what's different now? How do you do your job differently after something like that? It was a good question. An honest question. Rodriguez appreciated it. I ask myself different questions now, he said. Before, when I saw something that concerned me, my first thought was always, how do I control this situation? Now, my first thought is, what's actually happening here? And I give people the benefit of the doubt. I communicate first. I remember that most people in a courthouse are scared and confused, not dangerous and defiant. He clicked to another slide showing statistics. Since Judge Hendricks implemented new training protocols across the district, use of force incidents in courthouses are down 42%. Complaints against security officers are down 37%. And here's the interesting part. Security breaches and actual threats haven't increased at all. In fact, we're catching more real problems because we're not wasting our energy on false alarms. The skeptical officers were starting to look less skeptical. What changed? Rodriguez continued. We changed our mindset. We stopped seeing everyone as a potential problem and started seeing them as people who deserve our protection and respect. And it turns out, when you treat people with dignity, they respond better. They're more cooperative. They're less likely to escalate situations. Everybody wins. He spent the next hour going through specific scenarios, walking the officers through decision trees that prioritized communication and de-escalation. He showed videos of good interactions and bad ones. He had them role-play different situations, and he was honest about how hard it was to change ingrained habits. Some days I still feel that old instinct, he admitted. That urge to just grab someone and move them out of the way because it's faster than talking. But then I remember Judge Hendricks's face when she showed the courtroom her bruises. I remember how small I felt standing there while she explained to everyone what I'd done wrong. And I remember that I promised her I'd be better. After the training ended, several officers came up to talk to him. Some shared their own stories of times they'd used more force than necessary. Others asked questions about specific situations they'd encountered. One young officer, barely a year into the job, thanked him for being honest about his mistake. Most of the trainers just tell us what to do, she said. Nobody ever talks about what happens when you screw up. This felt real, Rodriguez smiled. It was real, still is. I think about it every single day. Later that afternoon, Rodriguez had a meeting with Judge Hendricks herself. They'd been meeting monthly since the incident, going over training materials and discussing ways to improve courthouse security protocols. The bruises on her arm had faded after a couple of weeks, but the impact of what happened hadn't faded at all. They met in her chambers, a book-lined office with a view of the downtown skyline. She poured them both coffee and sat down across from him at a small conference table. I heard your training session this morning went well, she said. The feedback from the officers has been positive, Rodriguez nodded. They're starting to get it. It takes time, changing the culture, but I think we're making progress. You are, she said. The statistics don't lie. Courthouse environments across the district are getting better, safer, more respectful. She took a sip of her coffee. I'm proud of you, Officer Rodriguez. You took the worst day of your career and turned it into something meaningful. He looked down at his own coffee. I still feel terrible about what I did to you. Good, she said, not unkindly. You should feel terrible about it. That guilt is what keeps you honest. It's what makes you a better officer. She set down her cup. But don't let it paralyze you, use it. Let it drive you to keep making things better. They spent an hour discussing the next phase of training, which would expand beyond just security officers to include bailiffs, clerks, and anyone who interacted with the public in courthouse settings. Judge Hendricks had successfully lobbied for funding to make the training mandatory statewide. This is bigger than one incident now, she said. Other districts are reaching out, wanting to implement similar programs. We might be looking at national adoption of these protocols. Rodriguez felt a strange mix of pride and humility. His biggest mistake was becoming a blueprint for reform. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it gave it purpose. As he was leaving, Judge Hendricks called out to him. Officer Rodriguez? One more thing. He turned back. I want you to know that I've forgiven you. Completely. I hope someday you'll forgive yourself too. Those words stayed with him as he walked back through the courthouse hallways. Forgiveness. He wasn't sure he deserved it, but he was grateful for it. And more importantly, he was determined to earn it every single day. 6 months after the incident, the changes were visible everywhere. Security officers spoke to people before touching them. They explained procedures instead of just barking orders. They recognized that the frightened teenager with a minor charge needed different handling than an actual security threat. The courthouse started to feel less like a place where people were processed and more like a place where justice was genuinely served. The young mother with the baby, the one who'd been in the courtroom that day, wrote a letter to Judge Hendricks. She said that her recent visit to the courthouse for a follow-up hearing had been completely different from her first experience. The security officers had been kind. Someone had even held her baby while she went through the metal detector. Small things, but they mattered. Judge Hendricks kept that letter in her desk drawer. On hard days when the weight of her position felt overwhelming, she'd take it out and read it. Proof that change was possible. Proof that one terrible moment could spark something better. And Officer Rodriguez kept his promise. Every training session, every interaction with the public, every moment when he felt that old instinct to control rather than communicate, he remembered. He remembered the bruises. He remembered the shame. He remembered the handshake. And he chose to be better. Because sometimes the worst mistakes we make become the most important lessons we teach. Sometimes the moment we fall is the moment we finally understand what it means to stand up and do better. And sometimes when someone extends their hand in forgiveness, the only appropriate response is to spend the rest of your life trying to deserve it. That's what Officer Rodriguez did. That's what Judge Hendricks made possible. And that's how one difficult morning in a crowded courtroom changed an entire system, one interaction at a time.